And this is a story that started with so much promise and so much hype, and really it ended with a whimper, and there was a lot of tragedy in that as well. And today we're going to talk about the Segway. Now, typically, if you've been on the show before, we take something that counts as emerging technology and really talk about why it could be big, why it probably isn't as hyped as it should be, etc. This time, I thought I'll do something slightly different. As my role as a dev evangelist slash dev advocate, I've often had to look at the past to sort of look at what will actually work in the future as well. Oops, sorry. And one thing that I've figured is looking at why tech didn't work in the past actually is very helpful. So this time I thought that I would look in the past at some piece of consumer tech that didn't work in a segment that I'm calling Back to the Future. You can tell that I'm great at Photoshop by that because that totally looks like me. Now, in this segment, I'm going to talk about one of the most hyped consumer technologies back in the day. This is a fascinating story. I mean, there are books about it, there are a lot of articles about it, but I'm going to try and get the gist of all of that happened in this show. And this is a story that started with so much promise and so much hype, and really it ended with a whimper, and there was a lot of tragedy in that as well. And today we're going to talk about the Segway. Now, for those of y'all who might not know, Segway is what you see here. Millennials probably, I don't know if y'all have seen these around, but essentially in 1994, there was this dude named Dean Kamen. Now, Dean Kamen was a serial inventor. He was like the old Silicon Valley darling, before Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk were, they were around, but they weren't like big. And essentially, he was a serial inventor who had earlier filed a patent for a wheelchair that could actually walk upstairs and do other cool things. There is a famous photo of him meeting the then president Bill Clinton, shaking his hands and demonstrating the wheelchair and things like that. And he came up with this invention called the Segway, which would change urban mobility forever. It was essentially what you see here. It was two wheels, like this handle-like thing, and you could go around wherever you wanted. And there was so much hype about it. In fact, Steve Jobs himself said that this is as big a deal as the personal computer. And Steve Jobs had something to do with the development of the personal computer. Later, though, he did retract that, and we will get to that in a bit. In fact, it wasn't just Steve Jobs. There's this dude named John Doerr who is this famous VC, and he was invested in things like Netscape. Again, millennials, you might not know what Netscape is. You should probably look that up. And also invested in Amazon.com back in the day, Big Daddy. So this guy knew his stuff, and John Doerr also said this is going to be more important than the internet, and we will probably sell 1 billion devices in like few years, and it's going to be huge, etc. It was so big that it was actually called the IT. So a few of us, we used to, back in the day when we used to read about it, it used to be referred to as the Segway IT because it was the IT thing. Again, it was so popular that South Park actually made an episode about it before it was launched. And I remember watching this episode on, pirated DVD back in the day. This was what they called the Segway IT. And essentially you could ride this, and it had those phallus-shaped things which would go into your... never mind, just watch the episode. I don't want to explain it. They also had John Travolta ride one of those, which was really hilarious at the time, and still is, to be honest. So there was all this hype about, this amazing device, this thing that will change urban mobility forever. So much so that I think sometime in the early 2000s, this show actually got a launch on Good Morning America, something that would probably never happen. And I'm just actually going to play a quick part of that video as well.
It's time.
Here we go.
Do we have to do something here, or does it? It does it by itself. All right. There it is. Now, what does it do?
This is the world's first self-balancing human transporter.
Self-balancing human transporting. You stand there, it goes forward and backward.
It's sort of like putting on a pair of magic sneakers. You stand on this Segway HT, and you think forward, you go forward. You think backward, you go backward.
Well, now, wait a minute. You think forward.
Yeah, so you can imagine the hype. Honestly, it was a big deal. Imagine in the early 2000s, you're on Good Morning America, you're wearing denim shirts with denim pants, big fashion faux pas, and you're exuding this confidence and saying, yeah, you think you need to go forward, you can go forward, etc. Reasonably a big deal. Now, what I didn't mention earlier was when it came to Steve Jobs, Dean Kamen, John Doerr, they actually met. And another person at this meeting was Jeff Bezos, because all of them met in this secret location in a hotel to actually discuss the future of this Segway IT, as it was called, because everyone thought it would be so big. And Bezos, to his credit, was actually very impressed with the product, but he had something interesting to say, which was, hey, you'll have no problem selling this, but the question is, are people going to be allowed to use it? And I think that was the starting point of, maybe something could go wrong, because there was no regulation around it. There was no law or compliance around it. Up until then, mobility in a city meant a car or a bike. And along came something which was neither, but it was also both. So he was quite prescient when it came to that and said, I'm not sure if people will be allowed to use it. Steve Jobs also, even though he was impressed with the design and a few other things, he said something, again, very prescient in the meeting. And he said, this is great, I can get the campus in Stanford to run an experiment, run a test. But even if one person meets with an accident and gets hurt, this is going to go online and give you a bad rep. Now remember, this is the early 2000s. There was no YouTube, but people were just starting to get to the internet. A few of y'all might remember the early email forwards of that dancing baby that actually turned up on Ally McBeal and things like that. So these videos actually got shared, and Steve Jobs was very prescient about the fact that that could cause some problems. Now, honestly, that's where it started to go wrong, almost literally after the product was launched. Because it was launched, it's not like it got like an insane number of buys in the beginning itself. Because as soon as people started seeing these ads after all the hype, they didn't react to it the way Segway thought they would. There was a famous quote that actually says it invited mockery and not awe. People thought everyone would go, hey, this is amazing, this is awesome. But people always mocked the others who would be riding the Segway. And honestly, it took a while for people to get used to the form factor as well. Because unlike a traditional kick scooter, and I'm sure you know what that is, it has like a handle with like a thing at the bottom and two wheels. Literally anyone, like able-bodied person should be able to get onto a kick scooter and start moving with it. But the Segway, it actually took a little, training to get that right. And that barrier wasn't enough for people to actually, just try it out. In fact, Steve Jobs was so right that, again, sometime in the 2000s, there were a bunch of accidents involving Segway ITs. And the most famous was, of course, George W. Bush, who was vacationing and fell and had this nice bruise on his face after that as well. To his credit, the video again is online. To his credit, he did regain some of his balance and, didn't completely faceplant. There were many other high-profile fails. Piers Morgan broke few ribs while using this, and Ellen actually was using this on her show live on the Ellen DeGeneres show and had this nasty tumble. Honestly, looking at it though, George Bush, Piers Morgan, Ellen DeGeneres, maybe the Segway, it was smarter than we give credit for. Yeah. But this actually did cause, a lot of negative publicity for people who wanted to probably buy one of these. There were other reasons why it failed though. One is the cost. Honestly, a lot of times this comes down to cost, and the pricing model just didn't work. This actually cost $9,000 on launch, when it was launched commercially. And in 6 years, basically, after 6 years rather, they had sold just 30,000 units of this, which honestly is not enough by any standards. And this is after reportedly spending $100 million in research and development. And also, when this was being developed, Dean Kamen was extremely, extremely paranoid about security. He knew that if they did a small launch, people would immediately imitate it and there would be clones everywhere. But if they did a big launch, other things could go wrong, and the pricing and things like that could not work in their favor. They also were so paranoid that they didn't outsource the manufacturing to any other country, like typically China or Southeast Asia. They did the manufacturing at home or in-house because they didn't want the designs to go public. The good thing is the design was so good that the Segway, it was actually a little too durable. A lot of the postmortems, including by people in the Segway leadership, have now gone on and said that it was so durable that after 4 or 5 years they took apart used Segways and they were perfectly fine, and people weren't buying newer parts or newer Segways. It was too good. And it was probably an engineering marvel at the time, but unfortunately it worked against their business model. To their credit, though, Segway really tried. They had things like, I'm sure you've seen those Segway tourist tours in a lot of the famous tourist cities. They are 100% part of Segway's marketing. They were paid by Segway to actually do this. You've seen the most amazing movie of all time, Paul Blart 2 Mall Cop. Again, please don't watch it; it's crap. But it was placed there as part of a promotion. That there were Segway polo games. Sweden's police for a brief period of time used Segways. If I'm not mistaken, I think even 21 Jump Street shows, one of the movies in the series shows Channing Tatum on a Segway. So they really tried hard to push this, but it just didn't work. So we have already gone from how this went from hype to completely deflated. There is one very tragic part of this whole story. This was in 2009 essentially, and in 2009 this company was bought over by a British millionaire called Jim Heselden, and he was riding his Segway in the British Isles, and he was on a cliff, and he, out of courtesy, the British are so polite, he actually gave way to a person walking their dog, and he lost control of his Segway and tumbled down a cliff. I know that sounds ironic and whatever, but it is a pretty tragic story. He had actually acquired the company from Dean Kamen in 2009, and he rode the scooter off a cliff and passed away. And it's just one of those bad epilogues to at the end of a fairly tragic story to begin with as well. The prologue, though, now is a company called Ninebot, which is a Beijing-based transportation company and a robotics company. They acquired Segway in April 2015, and they were manufacturing the same Segway ITS, as I like to call it. They're not the official name, but I still like to call it that, up until earlier this year. So in June 2020, they announced that they're ceasing production of the Segway company, the Segway IT, although they're still making things like the kick scooters and other different models, which are still available on their site. At the end of it, after all of this, after more than 10 years, almost 20 years now, reports say that they've sold only about 140,000 units worldwide, which honestly is fairly low for something that was so hyped. And I think this is a good story about technology, about things like why pricing matters, why actually like being launching your product at the right time actually matters, and and actually knowing and figuring out compliance and regulatory things for something so different actually again matters so much. So this was a story. All is not lost though. The Segway brand is still fairly strong, and Dean Kamen and Segway own about 1,000 patents related to scooters and urban mobility. So honestly, they have all those patents, they can still make money off it, and it was an engineering marvel way ahead of its time. Anyway, I think that's it for me from now. Leave a comment if you like the show. Stay safe. I will see you here, same time, same place, next week as well for the last stream of the year. I'll be taking a week's break after that. Hope to see you soon. Hope you learned something new today, and goodbye.